All right, Builders Build, episode 7, and this week we're talking about cannabis and building cannabis brands. So why are we talking about cannabis? Well, it's because it's a generational opportunity. It's not just because we work inside of the industry or have experience in it. It's something that is interesting and exciting to tons of people, whether they're actually working on it or not. Why is it that exciting? Why is it a generational opportunity? Well, a lot of it is because everything that we see and sell today is essentially commoditized, whether that's liquor or experiences or clothing or widgets or refrigerators or whatever it is. It's existed for a long time. There's entrenched brands, and if you're building something new, you're competing with that. In cannabis, it's all brand new, and it's still emerging, and it's still just a fraction of the TAM, the total available market, of what it's going to be. So this is truly a generational opportunity we see once in a 100 years. So, and these brands that are being crafted right now that are succeeding are going to be able to grow to hundreds of millions of dollars in record speed if they execute right. So of the landscape today of what's already been built in cannabis, there's only a handful of actual brands that have been established as something that people know. So one of them is Cookies, probably the most likely anyone listening to this pod has heard of. Another one that's close is Stixx, more on the West Coast, but people have kind of heard of it in general. Sorta MedMen, in that they've heard about it, they may have experienced it, but now that it's been splintered off, it doesn't really have that power. And there's a handful of people that are emerging. So Jungle Boys and 710 are there. They're kind of big within the culture. Timeless, kind of out of Arizona. Violux, they've got a ton of press. They're bubbling. People might know about them in a couple areas or in some regions, but they haven't really crossed over to everywhere, but they're kind of on that next tier. So that's where the massive opportunity is saying, okay, if I can actually jump into this next tier, because you can start a brand in cannabis tomorrow and still make it to that top tier. This opportunity is wide open. And a lot of it happens out of California. So we have a lot of experience with it directly. And I think it's something that we're really excited to talk about, because whether you're in the industry or not, or want to build something in the industry or not, it's just a unique time and a unique microcosm of how do you create something, and authentic versus inauthentic, and how culturally relevant it is versus how corporate the industry is in some ways. So it's just a really unique thing to dive into, and we're excited to do it. So we're going to start off with a point from Colin that he loves to talk about real brands and brands that are from the culture versus brands that are corporate or kind of made by suits. And I'll let you take it from there, brother.
I would love to dive right in, but I've been completely derailed by your lack of esoteric random bullshit in our intro. Last week we were talking about the conquest of the Americas in the intro. I was hoping to pick that up.
This is dead serious, brother. This is Builders Build this is a performance based podcast, and so if you guys don't want to take this seriously,
changed?
If you don't want to hit this alpha, then get out. Then you know what I mean. We're here to execute. This is an execution podcast.
Oh man.
If I can make a change in my life, you guys can make a change in your lives.
Fair enough.
Like you said, the whole dichotomy of real brands versus these more or less manufactured brands is something I talk about and think about a lot in cannabis, because you've got this whole MSO sphere. I think that MSO is a multi-state operator.
And that is hard in cannabis because it's actually hard to operate in different states, different compliances, license costs money. Right. It's a whole set
bunch of fragmented.
So if you are doing that, you're an MSO, that means that you're big. You are also likely public, or at least a good chunk of them are. So anyway, keep going.
So I think you've got all these brands that come out regularly these days that are more or less, marketing agencies hired by MSOs. Maybe it's internal. There's press releases. They're then propped up by journalists as being valid brands, when in reality, these are things that basically dreamt up in a back room, slapped on a package ID, and then taken to market, or not in a lot of cases, right? A lot of these things exist purely in mock-up form. And that's how a lot of brands start, right? But then on the other side of the coin, like Oren mentioned, you have these brands that have been here for 10 years, right? And what that means is they're ingrained in the culture. They have community built around them, and they're not just popping up out of nowhere overnight with a Forbes feature on it to make it look real. And to that end, on the West Coast, said brands have actual shelf space across hundreds of retailers versus a lot of these brands that are generated in the back room, hit the shelves of, my MSO's 13 resale stores, and that's the end of it. So it's really this is a huge part of the dynamic in the industry to me. Again, these brands born out of legacy stuff versus the stuff that pops up tomorrow. And I think that it's really going to be a lot of the next 5 years are going to be defined by these sorts of dynamics.
Agreed. And I think something that we also talk about a lot is the crutch of premium. And so this idea that, people always wants to create a brand in the space. And everyone wants to say, okay, well, it's not a lot of margin. Things are competitive. We can't write off these things in our taxes. We want to get as much margin as we can. We need to do premium brands. We want to charge the most for it. And premium is extremely hard. And I've worked on premium products outside of cannabis and in cannabis. And to do a premium brand, you have to really own and live premium like through and throughout your entire existence. Every piece of product experience has to be perfect. Customer service has to be amazing. Packaging always has to be on point. Your experience with the B2B has to be perfect. Your marketing has to be next level. And it seems like that sounds easy when you just rattle off a couple bullet points. It's extremely hard at every level. And then also a big thing to understand there is if everyone's competing on this one space, but that's not the space people consume in. Because if you look at cannabis, for instance, most people smoke outdoor, sun-grown weed that is the cheapest weed that they can likely get. That is the biggest segment of the market by far. And so you're going to take this one little segment, everyone's going to compete over it and have to offer an experience that's almost impossible to get right and consistent in like a rapidly changing market. And so I would say if you are interested in going and making brands, like I wouldn't go premium. I would go mainstream. And guess what? Maybe that means you have to get to scale faster, or you have to you have to figure out how you're going to be able to function with a different kind of margin setup. But unless you really know how to execute premium and can do it, and also know that you're fighting for a small subsection of the market, it's not a place to lean into.
And even then, the premium brands that we see ride the waves of price sensitivity on this are the ones that have been doing that for 15 years, right? That are ingrained in the culture and have something that you can't just go and make overnight or go buy.
Yeah, and say, hey, I'm gonna put a really nice logo and branding set on this. Why can't I charge
exactly.
$40 more? Because that is what you can do in other segments. Like we've talked about this in other Builders Bills, where you can go say, hey, I'm gonna go make a branded set of socks. But if your socks are cashmere and you put them in some really nice packaging and you have an excellent branding set, you probably can command a significant multiple. But that isn't the same on if you're just taking the same cannabis and putting it in a nicer jar and then trying to charge more.
And I think it also goes back to just the fundamental of when we're creating products or brands. We need to be talking benefits, not features. And really, really good isn't a benefit. It's a feature, right? Taste, that's a benefit, or effect, that's a benefit. But really, really nice, and you should pay for the price tag that we want you to pay for. Those are not benefits. Those are features, if anything at all, and they're not something you can build a brand on in any space, and certainly not cannabis.
And so one thing I want to touch on and pass over to James is, when we're actually talking about cannabis brands, it's kind of hard to not talk about public markets or talk about companies that own multiple brands. And, I think we were in this scenario where when cannabis first started, there was just naturally no brands. There was just the ability to invest in companies that were entering into the space. And now we're at the point where brands are beginning to emerge, but a lot of those companies don't actually own those brands. And so, James, you have some experience. You ran, it'd be good to give you a little breakdown of what it was that you were running. But,
sure.
You ran basically a site that was aggregating information about some of these kind of public performers before brands were a thing. Like how do you see the space? How did that experience kind of inform how you think about it? And, what can people learn from that?
Yeah. So I think ironically, I have such a not contrarian point of view from you guys, but I come from such a different perspective, right? Because when I first got into this space in 2016, and we were dealing with LPs up in Canada, and LPs being licensed producers. That's sort of the equivalent of like MSOs today, right? Because in Canada, there's federal legislation that allows you you have Health Canada, which is like the governing body that looks over medicinal cannabis in Canada anyway, and they were handing out these licenses to LPs, licensed producers. And so I came from the perspective of, I think, always sort of looking from the banker standpoint, right? Which is sort of on the contrary to sort of the brand standpoint. For me, I've been saying this since 2016, and I believe this is that like
so eventually you're a suit.
I'm a suit.
James
I wish I was
James
a suit.
is a suit.
I'm more in this conversation. It's funny because even in the brands,
in his Yankees hat, and
of the groups, like he's the one who should lean into the personal brand with be out here rocking the Brioni. I'm just saying.
But is that I sort of believe, and every year I keep thinking it's going to happen. It hasn't fully happened yet from my perspective. But like eventually we're going to see just like obscene commoditized pricing pressure come on to the cannabis sector, right? Because the reality is when I was dealing with companies up in Canada that were just growing cannabis with no brand, and by the way, there's obviously legislation in different places that allow you to have brands and marketing and not. We can get into that a little bit later. But was that, in Canada, they were growing medicinal cannabis at like $1.80 a gram, $2 a gram indoor, right? And then all of a sudden I saw people starting to grow cannabis in Uruguay at 8 cents a gram outdoor, right? And so when it starts when you start pulling fungible extracts, right? And so we always talk about NFTs all the time, right? Non-fungible tokens, but fungible meaning exactly the same. When you start pulling isolate out of these plants, like THC or CBD, it's totally fungible, right? And so the reality is that when you start hitting a vape pen that's just THC, or you're putting CBD into something, you're not going to know or care whether it came out of really, really fantastically grown indoor medicinal cannabis in Canada, or whether it came from like sort of lower quality cannabis grown in Uruguay at 8 cents a gram, right? So as we see the globalization of this industry, I think we're going to see this pricing pressure. And you guys obviously know about this more than I do, but more and more and more pricing pressure. And as federal legislation changes, you're going to have brands that can go across state lines more. And you're going to have cannabis that's just grown. Oregon's got this glut, right? Like I don't buy my corn from Miami. Like my corn comes from Iowa, right? Where all the corn is grown, right? So anyway, but to circle back to brands, I think that sort of the only differentiator that I realized is that brands are the only real differentiator for this totally commoditized good in the long run, right? Obviously, you can have really, really high quality flower. You've got terpene profiles that make things taste and smell a certain way, and I think people argue that that'll make they'll change your high if you're consuming. But in general, you are really talking about a commoditized good, i.e. pork bellies, oil, right? Like when you buy oil, when you put gas in your car, doesn't matter whether you stop at BP or you stop at Mobil. The gas goes into your car, makes your car drive, right? And so what happens is crude oil comes from all over the world. It gets refined, homogenized. When you drink milk, that's homogenized milk. That is milk that is probably from thousands of cows put into one place. They homogenize it. And then it goes into your milk carton with hundreds of different cows' milk in one. Anyway, so I think that the brands are the true differentiator in this space in the long run, and that's how sort of you'll be able to hold on to margin. And yeah, when I first started playing in it, it was just finance guys buying licenses and sort of attaching names to them. And then later on, through that world, I sort of got access to owning pieces of some brands in the space. So it's just a different perspective than I think you guys have. But so, yeah, we just aggregated we can do another pod on another time, but we just aggregated financial news in the cannabis sector for a long time. And to touch on what Oren said, I think what's exciting there is that when you have this industry, a nascent industry like this, is that you can find these little pockets of we became the largest financial news site in the cannabis space, right? Just because no one else was doing it. Right. In the same way that there's a lot of operators in the cannabis space that came on board that have the opportunity to make obscene amounts of money, because a lot of the bigger players, if you're big in alcohol, you probably aren't going to go play in the totally federally illegal cannabis space yet. Right. So it creates opportunity for people.
And I think that's interesting too, because I think there's a lot of opportunity in what you did and similar still in cannabis, where I think you're going to make more money. Actually, I'll take a step back. I think there's two areas where there's a significant amount of alpha in the cannabis space today if you want to start a company. The first is doing something like James did, where you're actually selling picks and shovels. Either you're making software or you're aggregating data to the space. It's more competitive. I think when James was in it, he was in it at the perfect time. If you want to get really ahead of something, you could do that in like the emerging psychedelic space or something like that currently.
Real quick, I mean, really, like any services industry niched into cannabis is like a layup, right? Because you will generally ride a similar curve to the overall growth of the cannabis industry, which I think we can all agree is going to be huge. But without licensing, without a lot of the regulation, probably not totally free and clear of like having life be easy. That's a hell of a path in my opinion, but that's a different podcast.
Yeah, but I guess, but there are, if you are looking to kind of get into that, there's, creating a brand. I actually do think that there's an opportunity to create asset-light brands out of California and one or two other emerging states where you're trying to get to $3 to $5 million a year in revenue with cash flow positive revenue without having to own a bunch of licenses or put big costs up by kind of connecting the dots and adding branding. I think those are, you can sell brands like that for 1 to 1.5x revenue right now, which is something you could build in a year and get to kind of millions of dollars is interesting. But basically these services and software that, just like Colin was talking about, like niching a CRM specifically for X, like that kind of stuff is a real big opportunity. And then some of these smaller brands, but without having to own and access to tons of assets, because I think it's this point those are still only going to get more commoditized, are actual unique opportunities in the space. But yeah, dude, passing on into I think we're going to go through a series of brands here and just talk about them and our involvement in them and what we found interesting about them or what we might be able to learn from it. And the first one I want to hit is a brand that Colin was part of the origin story of, which is Stixx, which is an unrivaled pre-roll brand that's now sold probably 3 million plus pre-rolls to date up and down the West Coast. I want to give a quick background on that, the origin story behind it, the value of the brand, why it's had staying power.
Yeah. So each of the brands that are one of my creations or at least partial creations are going to touch on one of the theses that we've been talking on so far. So for Stixx is the antithesis of premium, right? It is a value-driven brand. I've always used the muse Bud Light for it, right? Bud Light is something that you know what you're going to get every time. It's accessible. It's not the cheapest beer in the aisle, right? I hate the alcohol comp, but here we are. I just made it. And so Stixx is really centered around consistency and accessibility price-wise, right? So that means the initial SKU we did there was a pre-roll. And that means we just beat to death the process of making a pre-roll so that we knew that we could make literally millions of them consistently every single time. So that, again, for consistency, you could go anywhere up and down the West Coast, grab a stick. You generally know what you're going to expect, even if it's a different strain, so on and so forth. And it's going to be the same every time. And so that was really built on the back of just good value and consistency, and explicitly not premium. And after going into pre-rolls, right, we extended that to carts, but it wasn't crazy full spectrum carts. It was a pretty run of the mill distillate and botanical terps cart, just because that is way more in line with the value brand than the super high spectrum X, Y, and Z carts. So just totally different product position out of the gate for something like that. And then over time, it's kind of molded into, we do moon rocks, we do infused pre-rolls, and really in the spirit of bang for the buck, right? High THC for still a relatively value brand. And kind of taking that to the next place, but also been able to differentiate the product and not just be flower. So on and so
interesting, when you have a brand where the value is consistency and the value is, hey, so Stixx has it's a perfectly rolled pre-roll, uses this proprietary process to create it. The value and consistency is great for entrepreneurs kind of across the board because it's something that you can automate. We run a lot of Stixx pre-rolls inside pretty advanced machinery. And it's something that you can't do for a lot of other things in the space that enable it to be a kind of a more profitable product overall. Also scalable across a number of different things. And so when you think about that, hey, do I want to create a premium thing? Or do I want to create something where I can actually really automate the process, whether you're in cannabis or not? That's an interesting opportunity. And so something that is worth kind of thinking through and kind of having in your toolkit. Anything else on Stixx before we hit on to the next brand?
Nope. James,
right,
what do you got?
I think it's Kanuka. A great transition because the next brand is Kanuka, which is a brand I used to have a piece of and run digital for. It's a CBD and Manuka honey mastige skincare brand. And so mastige being sort of not super premium, but for a mass market, but still a little prestige.
Mastige. I've never heard that.
Yeah.
It's actually, I love the term.
Is that a James Explains?
James Explains mastige.
I wish I made it up. But yeah, it's part of the mastige beauty space. And so what's really interesting about that to connect it to the Stixx stuff is, so the products that go inside Kanuka are CBD, Manuka honey, and a bunch of other things, right? But that's the two key things here. And so really at scale, consistency becomes really difficult unless you're using things like isolate, right? It becomes very, very difficult. And so, because how do we know with flower, how do you keep, right, the exact same sort of THC content in every single flower, right? Especially if you're sourcing flower. Please.
Can I unpack that? If you will.
Please go for it.
So James mentions isolate, which is typically going to be 99% cannabinoid. A lot of time its form is going to be like a white powder. A lot of SKUs really in CBD and THC that are this more run-of-the-mill type product, but especially in topicals are using isolate or distillate. Distillate being a distilled oil, right? Where if you go from I've got flower that's 28%, that's 20% THC, all the way to I have this oil that is, anywhere from 60 to 90, maybe 90 plus percent THC. And so what you have there though is when it's 90% THC, that means that 10% is something else, right? It's fats, it's lipids, and plant material in that oil. And so by using, the more refined and distilled you get, the more consistent and pure, you get that THC or CBD or what have you. There's a whole nother conversation on what you don't get with that. But in the case of Kanuka with James, using the 99% isolate means there's just like, it's exactly the same every single time. There's no other baggage in there with it.
And that's a great breakdown of it. I think it's important. What becomes, I think, tough is when you really, and I won't get too far into it, but we had conversations about sort of Kanuka becoming much, much bigger and doing much, much bigger stuff. And some of those conversations were with multi-billion dollar CPG like conglomerates. And what became clear to us at the time when we were talking about CBD, for example, was we think there's so much CBD, but if, for example, if Heinz Ketchup wanted to put CBD in Heinz Ketchup, there's not enough CBD right now produced to put CBD in Heinz Ketchup, right? It's just the amount, the scale of, and sort of, I'm a firm believer that CBD is going to become obscenely ubiquitous in skincare in the way things like resveratrol did, right? Like there was points in time where you would just buy resveratrol, skin tightening, anti-aging stuff. And now it's just in everything. It's like when you buy a Coca-Cola, it says with caffeine, right? At one point, caffeine was its own really special thing, right? And now just every single soda you buy has caffeine in it, right? So at some point, I believe that CBD will become that ubiquitous, but sort of for that to happen, everything needs to be done like in an ISO lab, in a GMP facility, you know what I mean? All these different things. And so it's hard to do at scale. Anyway, to go back to the brand stuff, one thing that was really exciting and interesting for us there was that because it was CBD and it was not federally illegal like THC, and it was all derived from hemp, which is irrelevant really, but sort of hemp is actually, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but hemp is the same thing as marijuana, just a lower THC count by the Farm Bill Act in the United States. Below 0.3% THC, I think, is legally industrial hemp. But what was really exciting for us was we got to go into traditional big retail in the US, right? So we were in every single Ulta store. We were in Neiman Marcus, Nordstrom, Free People, Urban Outfitters. 2000 Ulta stores is pretty massive, right? So when Ulta starts giving you end caps, i.e. when there's like a row of products and at the end is when you see the products at the end, that's an end cap. When Ulta starts giving you end caps, you start selling a lot of product, right? And so when you start hitting these sort of high 7-figure, low figures, 8 figures in sales because of retail, it really opens up even the DTC side of it and even in the more cannabis retailers because people just know about your brand and look for it more. So I don't want to go too deep into that because it's a little strayed. My growth in that was like a small piece. And I feel like it's different from everything else we have here, which is really predicated on actual, THC driven cannabis brands. But I think what the interesting takeaway is there's a massive opportunity if federal legislation changes in that way, it's going to go fully legal at some point, but for larger retail footprints to take this stuff on, right? And so we talked about MedMen earlier, and that's interesting because MedMen is sort of the massive, forget from a public markets perspective, right? And how the business is run, but I mean like retail footprint. I'm assuming MedMen's got one of the largest retail footprints in the United States. This is really crazy. There's a MedMen on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, right? Like straight up. And like this, there has been for years. And it was sort of just like let's plant this flag, right? This is, there's a Columbia Care in Brooklyn. There's a few other, you know what I mean? But like really early MedMen took a Fifth Avenue store. And that's when they were like trying to be the Apple. I think that everyone was calling MedMen the Apple of cannabis retail. They
really kind of went for that. They just went for it really early. And so I think that's an interesting one to talk about. And maybe we'll jump up with the list a little bit because I had dispensary brands on here a little later, but I can just give a quick hit on that where it's like, there is going to be that idea that you're going to see dispensary brands of all kinds that are, it's a little bit different than building an actual brand itself. But right now what you see is either someone like MedMen who said, hey, we're going to have a retail footprint across everywhere, or you see brands that then have retail footprints because of how well their brand is doing. And Cookies and Stizzy are good examples of that. Opening a cookie store is a big event, whether that's happening in Canada or Las Vegas, but you're capitalizing off of the actual product brand and then adding the retail brand on top of it. And now they're sort of one and the same. And then you have these MSOs who are basically opening their stores either under their actual name. So Trulieve, big MSO, opens a Trulieve store, or Columbia Care, a big conglomerate, opens a Columbia Care store. But you don't really see that. Like that's not what you see in alcohol, or other. You don't see like the parent company doesn't open a store under their own name. And then you have people who are playing it more like it actually is, where they say, hey, we have some big overall company. Like GTI is a good example, where they have GTI, but then their stores are all called a bunch of like different things. They have Essence, they have a few others that are kind of have different approaches for different retail experiences. And I think that's the right approach, right? Where it's, hey, how do we create something where it has a brand over time? We have our high-end store. We have our mega store for where it's near big populations. We have our boutique store for in kind of different approaches. But that has yet to be written. And I do think it is it's easy to really well brand a single retail location and sort of make it stand out from the rest by applying some just good graphics, good communication, good content. Getting a chain and making it kind of stand out takes significantly more and is something that is kind of happening in front of our eyes. But you have to basically think about that as basically a regional chain or a national chain, and how do you position yourself to kind of do both? Because that's the kind of thing that's going to take big investment and big time and is completely unwritten. Like there are no set winners who are going to go through that. And of the ones that are winning, they're probably going to end up renaming, at a decent amount of time as you see kind of things change or people get really more in line with consumer tastes.
I think I've thought about this space a lot, especially in terms of the CPG, the consumer packaged goods element of it. And while on one hand, there really is, especially on the CPG side, there is no playbook or textbook for exactly how those types of brand relationships should be done separately from like a corporate entity or a holdco. The flip side of it is like in no mature category does the stuff that is happening in cannabis actually exist down the road. And you can say that whether it's like you don't go into the store and buy Mountain Dew nacho cheese tortilla chips, right? You buy Doritos tortilla chips, right? And there are a couple different flavors of them, right? And then on the front of the brand name store, right? Nike Town is the first one that comes to mind for me, right? I'm in Portland, the footwear capital of the world. A Nike Town is all Nike, and we're a long ways from going into a Stizzy store or a cookie store that is pure cookies, right? There are other products on those shelves, and there will be. And so I don't think while the immediate reaction is like, oh, cookie store is like a Nike store, it's really not. It's a different play. It works for cookies because of how dominant their brand is, but you can't argue with the fact that like in mature industries is not how it works. It is not how it plays out. You don't buy M&M's crackers. You buy Cheez-It crackers, right?
Yeah. Well, this is what interesting because it's like a new playbook. Again. They're like jumping the line. They basically became the M&M store, fast versus saying, hey, we're going to be in other stores,
Right. And I think we're at a point in it where you can, if you can execute, you can do, there is no playbook. There's no playbook. Yeah. To me, it's just like you have to have some awareness around like what this ultimately looks like. And you probably make your life easier if you set yourself up for that, even if we're talking about down the road where you have more of this like this family of brands with relationships to each other rather than it's all truly.
A lot of it has to do with like a money play too, because it's so hard to. You can only trade on certain exchanges, etc. Like it makes sense for True Leaf to have True Leaf stores because that's more awareness of the company overall, which is more awareness of the stock, which is more money, which is playing for this other play. So like you can really see the argument in any number of ways. Like we're going to invest in brands now versus in our corporation because brands are really going to resonate. We're going to invest in getting our corporate name out there because that's going to lead to more capital. It's going to let us build brands later. Right. Like there's all these interpretations of the playbook, which I think is really why the space is so interesting to watch because you can kind of make your bets accordingly.
Well, I think to go along with the retail side of it, to talk about like cookies versus other sort of much more mature industries from Colin's standpoint, is that like I know that in other industries, like a lot of retail footprint for brands are loss leaders. These are sort of like intangible that you hope translates to tangible down the line, right? So people like if you have a store on Fifth Avenue and you're paying $200,000 a month for your rent, you are unlikely netting to that $200,000 a month in that store. But that is something that you do to be on Fifth Avenue or Madison when people are shopping there, so that you sort of have that cachet that goes along with it, right? And then and those numbers can be much higher even. And so I know there have been. It's interesting that cookies can pull it off because I think very often that these bigger brands are keeping these retail footprints more about sort of like having yourself there and being a reminder to people and having a way to return things and buy things, but it is not sort of this cash cow for them that I think DTC can be. So anyway.
Yeah. And so popping on down the chart, especially as we talk about value propositions and positioning, I want to talk about this brand Life that a friend of mine owns. So this is a fully sustainable cannabis brand. And to go back to the very beginning of, especially what James was talking about, like this is a commoditized thing. If you're growing 8 cents a gram in Uruguay, and even though you might have incrementally better, at some point, every kind of function of cannabis and really great cannabis is going to be able to be made at a really, really low cost. So how do you differentiate yourself? And there's a number of ways. There's brands that people have affinity to, and there's brands with purpose and mission. And so Life, they have a sustainable packaging. So their glass is recycled glass. Their lid is a proprietary biodegradable lid. Their pre-rolled tubes are biodegradable. The paper for the sales promos is biodegradable. They give, it's like 5% of proceeds goes to, these specific charities. They've really leaned all the way in on, it's a sustainable brand with sustainable packaging. The flower is grown in a sustainable way in sustainable facilities that utilize, reuse of water and all these other things. And that's how they plan to position themselves, like no matter where they go, which I think is really interesting because you can say, enter any state or angle and say, all right, is it worth more to the customer or is it more interesting to the customer? Even if they don't want to pay more, are they at least more likely to choose it if it has a message, if it has, something that resonates with them overall? And betting on sustainability is a good bet. And I think that right now consumers aren't necessarily shopping with that in mind. They're just shopping to actually have the experience. But as time goes on and you have to differentiate, there is plenty of customers who will want that, just like they'll want to purchase from social equity brands or women-owned brands or, brands that are specific to their, background or lifestyle. And so the sustainability angle is really interesting. And I do think that what they did with the Life brand is a great playbook for any other industry where you say, if I want to commit 100% to differentiating myself through, a cause or an issue, like really go in on it. Say, we're going to make sure that that's every method of how our product is produced, that every bit of the packaging goes on it, that our sales collateral reflects that our proceeds are given to it. That's this kind of new model. And, I know a lot of companies have shifted to B Corps now to kind of take advantage of that. I think it's an interesting position to play and, complicated when an industry is emerging, but, great for kind of what you look at down the line. Curious what you guys think about that, or if you've seen kind of other brands and other industries that have kind of taken that approach effectively.
I think it's as hard as you can get in terms of starting a brand right now in cannabis is the approach that Life has taken. So salute to that. And that's primarily around how price sensitive the industry is. Even the folks that care about these things walk into a store and pick the $7 pre-roll over the $11 pre-roll every single time. And the reality is even though the components of these things are getting more and more affordable, they're still so much higher than a cheap plastic tube in the pre-roll comparison. Another angle on this I think is really interesting is like what Glass House is doing, right? And I don't need to go too far down the Glass House sales pitch of indoor is bad, so on and so forth. But Glass House's theory is basically that we can control the environment inside glass greenhouses, so glass houses, and get the level of control that we might have in indoor. But instead of using these 1,000-watt HPS bulbs to imitate the sun, we're just going to use the real deal and use the sun, which of course gives the actual end product or the actual product itself a much different carbon footprint and sustainability score, if that's a thing, than otherwise, right? One of the biggest line item expenses in an indoor grow is that power bill, and it's twofold. It's to turn on the lights, and then it's to cool the air because the lights are so hot.
It's interesting to your point of the cost of the pre-roll X amount, $11 versus $7 or whatever it was. There's an interesting too that a lot of this is around the message. So if just the free game alert of if you are starting a brand in cannabis, the number one thing you can do is educate the people that sell at the retail stores, because it's so requires so much actual kind of experimentation and conversation around what is happening that that they're still the best conduit of that information. That if you do want to make that jump from 7 to 11, it's because they're recommending it to the customer. And so it is worth having a message that resonates with them. They're equally as important as a customer for a brand as is the end customer. And then ensuring that gets across. And so just something worth bringing up.
Absolutely. It's been interesting, right? So I live in Oregon. Oregon is like the capital of the world for, I'll say it with an eye roll if you're not watching, sustainable stuff. And there's just zero tolerance, right? So in addition to having the super green ethos everywhere in Oregon, it's also hyper competitive in the cannabis space. And at the end of the day, I watch people in Birkenstocks and tie-dye go in and buy the cheaper thing because it's cheaper, right? And it's a really interesting push-pull. It kind of highlights just the competitive nature that you have on the West Coast that you don't see other places, where there's an element of, unless you're like the 1% of brand, all that matters to get a foot in the door is price first.
It's interesting because I think that obviously as this industry matures, if we talk about alcohol, and I know you hate comping it to alcohol, and it's sort of a trope at this point that everyone comps cannabis to alcohol, but like there's tons of great examples of, Grey Goose was an alcohol brand that was bought out, rebranded, raised the price, and people buy it more, right? Like, so it'd be interesting to see at what point that price sensitivity sort of starts to sort of disappear. And it might just be that it has to reach a much more mass market, right? It might just be that there has to, because right now
it's maturity, if nothing else.
Yeah. I mean, I know that one of the first, not one of the first conversations you and I had, Colin, but I remember the first conversation you and I had in person. We were talking about how for years, and you had done the same thing, I had this sort of vision in my head where I was pitching the soccer mom, right, who wants like her vaporizer and to be super clean, and she replaces her glass of white wine.
Cannabis.
And like the reality is that that's such a tiny market segment still. And the reality is partially because she buys so little cannabis, right? Like if you hit your vape pen once a day, then great. Your vape pen lasts you for 3 months. And so maybe that will change when 330 million people in the United States are consuming cannabis, right? When it really is fully federally legal.
But either way, you look at the dollars they spend. Go ahead.
Yeah. The dollars, and then in that comp that we hate, the alcohol one. I mean, how long did it take for wine spritzers to happen? If you look at the lifespan of the alcohol industry, right? That is the thing you have to think about. I don't know the exact date.
I think it was 20 years of Everclear and moonshine before that.
Yeah, exactly. But that's exactly it, right? Because the hypothetical soccer mom, in 1950 also wasn't drinking the, whatever the beverage of choice then was. But all these categories emerged to make these drinks more accessible and more normal. The deal is it took 100 years, right, to get to where we are now. It obviously was shorter than that as it started to happen. But the starting point of all of this is innovation. And when the more competitive it is, as much as it makes it not fun a lot of time for operators in the industry, it's also that competitive nature is the spark of the innovation, right? Where you have all of these businesses that are trying to figure out how to make better and different products for less and less and less to be more competitive and beat out the next brand.
In one word,
that's a
capitalism. Just that's the beauty. That's
capitalism, baby.
It's capitalism. Yeah. Sorry. So
I think that's a good opportunity to jump, into one of the brands that James has worked with and has some background with. Is we've kind of talked about different differentiators here and where products are at, but you've worked with a brand that actually has a celebrity tie-in. You want to kind of break that down a little bit?
Yeah. So I'm an advisor. I have a little piece of a company called Palms. Palms is a pre-roll brand based in California. They are now in multiple states. And what's interesting about Palms, and at some point be fun to have sort of maybe have Noah, who's one of the founders, on the pod to talk about it a bit. But what's interesting about Palms is that it really is a brand, right? And so basically when they go to different states, they sell the packaging and license it to someone in the state who can actually can produce and sell that cannabis. And so in terms of building a brand, Palms has sort of gone for that middle market. Their pitch is that like, we don't really want the Everclear of cannabis. We're not selling moon rocks. We are not selling, rosin press hash. Like we are going after these sort of middle market, more like, I wouldn't say low THC, but more like the 20% range. Right. And so I see obviously cannabis coming out in the 30 to 40% range in flower, which is just crazy to me. Right. I like the idea that much of it might be THC. Anyway, point is that Palms in terms of capital raising had got a pretty strategic investor early on, a gentleman named Scooter Braun, and Scooter came and very recently last year brought in another investor named Justin Bieber. And so Justin Bieber ended up doing a sort of limited, smaller line, Jay the Beebs, called Peaches. And so that was a play on this song called, Peaches. I get my peaches down in Georgia. I get my weed from California. And so that was a pretty massive play for Palms because Peaches by Palms ended up getting picked up in a ton of different states by different dispensaries and different MSOs, and really sort of catapulted the trajectory of that brand in terms of revenue, but also just opened the door, right? So one thing I think is really interesting is like how you get your foot in the door. Like, let's say I wanted to start a cannabis brand tomorrow. I wanted a pre-roll brand. what would I go do? Knock on the door at MedMen and say, "Can I talk to your buyer?"
Yeah. Just to be super clear, that's exactly what you would do. And there's no, unless you're friends with Justin Bieber, yes, that's exactly what you do. You go hit the ground.
And even if you are, you still need the guy that goes and knocks on the door.
Yeah,
well,
literally.
That's a really, and you guys obviously deal with this all the time, but what a crazy antiquated sales process that is, right? Like, and I'm not saying it doesn't work, but like that's just not how other industries function these days, right?
I mean, yeah.
I mean, yeah. You have your trade shows.
It's the same way. Everyone's just inundated, just like anywhere else. They're inundated with emails, inundated with calls from hundreds of brands. It's impossible to dig through the noise. And having a salesperson actually show up is just an effective strategy. Sure. But it works in other industries too.
I guess in liquor, I hate to keep using the liquor comp, but I guess if you're a brand rep for liquor, you go you go to bars and you go to restaurants and you try and get them to open accounts, and that's very normal.
And think about like how did we get Solo into 2000 Best Buys, right? It wasn't by finding the purchaser at Best Buy. It was our distributor who had a relationship with the buyer and basically had already beaten down that door, right?
Yeah, well, but who had sales reps and also went and knocked on the door of every mom and pop hobby shop in North America
to get that shelf. So I think that is the way that's still the way. It's something that is totally lost on D2C brands, of which are super popular. In our echo chamber,
just take care of this for us.
Yeah, like in our echo chamber of Twitter, and then obviously also with people our age, but outside of DTC, like B2B sales get the shelf, right? And then your marketing gets it off the shelf, and cannabis is not different in that regard.
Well, I think what's interesting to think about is when it comes to like, obviously the Justin Bieber stuff really helps a lot for sales and getting doors open. But candidly, like there becomes a question, which is what celebrities align with cannabis or
that's what I was going to say, because this is actually one of the only success stories, because a lot of these cannabis brands that have that, it's not a success story.
I mean, I never forget when someone sent me the deck for Taste by Tyga, right? Like, and it was because Tyga had a song called
Tyga
Taste.
Bites. Legendary cloud kitchen application, not gonna lie, but
but yeah, and so obviously and sometimes it happens backwards. Like Burner from Cookies has become a celebrity in his own right from cookies, right? But in general, you had Seth Rogen attached to Houseplant, right? There's a couple that have kind of made sense, but I know that there's I have some other friends.
They don't have that right combination. These are interesting to talk about because, like, you get some of these, like Houseplant, for instance, got a lot of attention and a lot of press and PR. They don't actually sell weed. The flower was bad. They don't actually sell any weed, and they sell some beautiful accessories, and that's great. And they're going to keep going at it until they get it right. But it was funny. Someone had tagged us in a LinkedIn post or something where they were talking about it. It was like Houseplant had launched some consultancy to help socioeconomically disadvantaged people start cannabis brands, and it was like, and then people posting on being like, who how are they going to hire them to help you launch a cannabis brand? And then you should hire these guys.
11 stores.
But it is funny because there's like, and now it's almost a trope because you get these kind of B-lists. It's like Jadakiss' cannabis brand. I'm like, cool. All respect to Jadakiss, great rapper. Not sure if that's enough of a differentiation to get this weed. Totally. And you kind of see that across the board. And so really it is brand first. I think that one of the interesting thing about Peaches being that's one of the only ones where, I guess the quality of the product already existed enough. They already had that core brand platform from Palms. And it's like, all right, they kind of know what they're doing. And then you add that layer on top was actually effective because there's actually almost no other example I can find of an actually effective celebrity cannabis brand. Like they're trying really hard with Khalifa Kush. I'm not quite sure if that's working yet, but there's a few others that I'm actually seeing have any impact.
I think without an interesting thing here, I think celebrity partnerships are like generally way overrated in CPG and in consumer brands. The first one that comes to mind is like George Clooney and Casamigos, right? Like Casamigos is, I think, almost 10 years old, right? It's great tequila. It's got celebrity endorsements, all this stuff. It took 8 years for anybody to give a shit, right? And I would imagine what it took is like all of the other stuff besides the celebrity endorsement to stack up.
And then once you got there, it escalated at that next level because the endorsement exists. But I think it's a really good point. It's just another tool in the toolkit.
Yeah, exactly. But it's like historically, like it doesn't ever move the needle in the way that I think marketers want it to. What it does do is raise the profile, right? It can get the attention of the public market. It can get you the press, all those things. But it doesn't actually It's not a very good foundation for a business. In my
and I think, and free game alert, second one, if I was doing a brand right now and I wanted to say I need to add this on there, is I don't think I would, it wouldn't be, hey, get the celebrity endorsement. It would be bring on a popping influencer who really understands content and how content moves, and has a ton of other influencer relationships, and they got, I'd say million plus on TikTok or million plus on YouTube, and have them be the creative director and like literally give them a job. Be like, hey, you have your equity and you get whatever it is per year that makes an impact for you. And you need to be telling us who we collab with, how we create content, creating content for us, including us in that. And that will have 10x, 20x the value of the celebrity endorsement. It may not have the mass appeal and recognition of the brand, but it will tactically lead to your brand success faster.
Totally.
Yep.
And I think to finish up the Palms Peaches thing, and then we should move on to the next one, is that I don't want to say the exact numbers, but I just got, I've got the financials from last quarter for all the investors and partners. And I can tell you that like, that for sure worked, right? I mean, the Justin Bieber stuff for sure worked. And, but what I think is important to touch on there is that like every other celebrity endorsement we've talked about there, first of all, I also was a huge fan of the locks. I love Jadakiss. You know what I mean? Like, but I'm just saying, like, it is, I think if you're going to go celebrity, they either have to so align with the brand, like a Cheech and Chong or Snoop Dogg or something, right? Or you have to have someone that is so obscenely large that it, you know what I mean? Like, because when they announced the Peaches line coming out with Justin, like, it was in like Vogue and Vanity Fair and Bloomberg. I mean, it was not, like no one's doing that for Jadakiss. Right. And that's not me knocking Jadakiss, but I'm just saying, I think that you either have to find. Love you. We do, dude. I think Jada used to get $400 a night to come rap at One Oak at 4 a.m. on Wednesday nights. You know what I mean? So I know he's out there trying to get that money.
Jada.
But my point is, like, you either need to find someone that so fully aligns with who they are, or I think find someone that is so massive that like no one would ever think, right? No one would have ever guessed that Justin Bieber was going to launch a marijuana line. Right. And also to be clear, Justin, it's not just a marijuana line called Peaches. Like Justin is an owner in Palms now. Right. So he's incentivized to sort of make sure that these things keep pushing. And anyway, so and it also is not, it's not like a Justin Bieber's face. The line is Peaches. Right. Anyway, so enough of that. Let's keep going on. You guys know more about it. You guys want to hop
James
into
just talking his book. Came on the pod to talk his book.
100p.
If anyone wants to do some M&A around that, there's some, we can talk about some points, we do facilitations. All right, we're gonna hit. This is less to talk about the brand and more to talk about two kind of topics on there. We're gonna hit on Kuroba, which is like the core unrivaled brand, for a second. But there's two concepts I think are really interesting about Kuroba. The first is the idea of the stoner as the customer. Everyone wants to make product for the soccer moms, just universal stuff. But the people that buy the most and come to the dispensary multiple times a week are stoners. People that smoke hella weed.
People that actually consume.
And they spend a huge amount of money per capita. They care a lot. They care about the brand. They care about the history. And so that is like exactly who that brand is for and focuses on. And then the second thing I want to touch on, because it has a bit of a complicated history, is strains. And the idea that you can associate a strain with a brand or not, and how complex that is. Because you'll get this scenario where growers, sometimes for their own sake, will make a strain. Apple fritter is a good example, where there's a grower who like owns the apple fritter cut. But plenty of brands have then made a success off of apple fritter or have apple fritter, and people relate that to the brand, not necessarily the grower. And that hasn't gotten figured out in cannabis yet. And in Kuroba, we had cultivation's moved constantly. It started off with some third parties doing it who eventually started their own brands, and they grew some really specific strains that Kuroba was known for. When they decided to do their own brands and no longer grow for the brand, grow for Kuroba, all of a sudden that infrastructure and that was lost essentially. And then you have to take time and recreate it and find new places. But that's still an opportunity we're going to see across the US with these brands is getting the strains locked in and variations of those strains and developing that as both with this combination of kind of growers and brands is just kind of this interesting area that hasn't completely been fleshed out yet. But it's like Jungle Boys is known for their strains and their growth of flower, not as much for their products, right? There's interesting to say you can be known for products, you can be known for your genetics and kind of what's cultivated. You can be known for your retail. You can be known for one specific, your celebrity endorsement. There's so many angles to approach, which I think is really interesting. But I do recommend like picking one and really going hard, the way that obviously Palms is, put a lot in the Peaches basket. And then, Stixx is really focused on, their particular thing. The Life brand has their sustainability. Kuroba is going for stoners, like finding that one thing and going at it, not trying to be all things to all people. That's my quick rant. I'm sure there's a couple topics you can dive off of from there.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to emphasize that having a brand that is for people that consume the product is like a good first start.
Not for people that you hope consume the product. And go look at who consumes the product. Like having worked inside of dispensaries for a while, you get to be like, oh, it's really all walks of life, but it's a certain amount of this type of person, that type of person. And what do they really want? And asking those questions is like not done enough. Like these people aren't like rolling woods with their customers, and they should be.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that gets lost by journalists perpetuate this stuff. Shout out journalists, right? But I just saw a article about a pre-roll brand last week that basically is like their whole thing is like it's bad weed that is really, really low THC and won't get you high. And that'll have a nice little press cycle, might pick up a few shelves off of it, and then there won't be a business there. Yeah. No one will buy it after the fact.
Well, they graduate because tolerances grow, right?
Yeah. But, me too.
But, James, you'll buy it, and you'll buy it once every 3 months because you smoke hit a night.
I mean, when I was buying, so by the way, you want to go that low, I was just ordering hemp from Colorado for a long time. Do the
industrial hemp.
Yeah. You're out here, bro.
You take it right off the combine. Just, I mean, so I kind of had this unique experience of being in this space for years and then coming into Kurova and honestly, so I manufactured Stixx and Cabana and our brands, right? Like I sat with our creative director and we dreamed these things up and created these brands out of thin air and did all the things that I'm talking about. And for me, coming into working with Kurova was just like incredibly eye-opening. At this point, right, when I talk about Stixx has been around for 5 years, Kurova is 10, right? But again, coming into that, where you have a brand like Kurova, where you talk to a Kurova consumer at a store, and they're like, "Oh, I remember back in 2012 when I was, buying 1,000 milligrams down the street at the trap shop, and like this brand like came from something." Like everybody's got a story about the people that have been familiar with it have stories about these brands. They remember experiences around these brands, and that is something I think if you're starting a new brand that you need to keep in mind just in terms of who you're competing with and then like what you need to cultivate from the experiences with your product. It's very hard. It's going to take a ton of time and a ton of energy. And there's big pieces of it that have to just happen. You can't force. But that was like super eye-opening to me with Kurova, just how ingrained every like ounce of that brand is in its history and where it came from and how it was molded. That's the end of the rant.
All right, look, and we've covered a lot of things here, and I think it wasn't exactly like, hey, a blueprint of how you start it and do it, but since it's such a complicated new space, it was just a bunch of kind of brands and like various alpha that you can get from talking to them and discussing them. If you have a bunch of questions about it or want to start your own brand, just DM Colin at Landforce. He's happy to answer as many questions as you guys want. And we'll and I think, and are we going to hit a space on Friday? We're going to try to do a space Friday.
Let's go.
Call to action, baby. We're doing a space Friday. Bring your questions. Bring your checkbook if you're trying to do some M&A through James. Bring your fits if you want to get roasted, and and we're gonna figure that out. You can get the full details on Twitter. Other than that, it's builders.build. Sign up for the email list. Go with God.
With God we go. Builders build.
Stay rich.